Hey guys, Jay here and welcome to another cosplay tutorial. Today I'm going to be working on Crona's sword from Soul Eater. Not much to say here, so if you want to make this for yourself, there'll be a template that you can get to down in the description. So let's get started. For this sword, I'll be making it in a similar fashion as the Master Sword, where it's flat for the most part with the edges being triangle foam dowels. It's basically impossible to tell where the bevels start because the way they drew the sword for the manga and the anime makes it impossible to tell, so I decided this was probably the best. I'll be using 3 layers of EVA foam. The center, which will have a metal rod in it for support, will be 6mm thick and will be sandwiched between 2 pieces of 4mm foam. I cut out the template on the lines of the 6mm foam, but I left a bit of extra foam around the pattern on both of the 4mm pieces. This way I can glue them on one at a time and trim the excess off, which will ensure that it's cut to the right size. Cutting all of the layers on the line sometimes doesn't work out very well, and one layer might end up slightly smaller. Doing it this way prevents that from happening. Also, when I traced out both of the 4mm pieces, I flipped the pattern over for one of them, so I had 2 mirroring pieces. I fold the template in half on the center and mark it on the 6mm foam. I line the edge up with the edge of the foam on one side, then trace out the center line. Then I flip it over and repeat it on the other side of the same face. I do it this way because only the side with the Sharpie mark that touches the template is the center. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick, so doing this on both sides of the same face, it'll roughly be a 1/4 inch thick Sharpie mark dead center. All I have to do is cut out along the outer edges of the Sharpie and it'll be the perfect size for the metal rod, which is also about 1/4 of an inch thick. After cutting out the center of the 6mm layer, here's what it looks like. To glue the layers together, I'll be using contact cement. Remember that you have to wait about 5 to 10 minutes for it to be almost dry before the pieces can be put together. And that I use 2 coats because the foam absorbs the majority of the first coat. Also, for projects like this that use thinner sheets of foam, remember not to pull on the pieces because this will cause them to warp and your prop will look lopsided or bent. After gluing one of the 4mm pieces on, I use a utility knife to trim off the excess. Before gluing on the other 4mm piece, I need to put the core in place. As mentioned, I'll be using a metal rod. This is a water valve key cut down to the length that I want it, and then I hot glue it into the channel that I cut out of the 6mm foam. Then I glue on the other side. This is why I made the 4mm pieces mirrored. In order to fit the second one onto the rest of the layers, you have to flip the whole block over, which would be mirrored from the other side. And just like the other side, I cut off the excess so that the layers are even. In case you didn't notice already, the 3 layers of foam that I used to build the thickness of the blade equals 14mm. This is because the triangle dowels that I want to use for the edge are also 14mm. The last couple of times I did this, I used 3 sheets of 15mm foam, which made the blade 1mm thicker than the triangle dowels. This made it very hard to line up everything nicely, so this eliminates that problem by making the blade the same thickness to begin with. These are just contact cemented on, same as the 3 layers, just along the sides. Which, speaking of, I should mention that there are 2 lines on the pattern. The inner dotted line is where I cut the pattern out. If you want to instead sand the edges in, then cut out the full template on the solid line. But if you want to do what I'm doing and use these triangle dowels, just cut it along that dotted line. Also, you could use super glue on these if you wanted. It might actually be easier, since only the sections that have glue on them will stick down, giving you better control. But that's up to you, just do whatever you want. And here's what it looks like with both edges glued on. With the base of the blade done, I move on to the handguard. I cut out the template 5 times. 2 were cut out of 10mm foam and 3 were cut out of 6mm foam. The center layer is 6mm just like the blade, and then that is sandwiched between the 2 10mm pieces. Then that block is sandwiched between the last 2 6mm pieces, making it a total of 38mm thick. The center layer also has a cutout going through it exactly the same as I did with the center of the blade, and this will allow it to slip over the metal rod. To make sure I know where the cutout needs to be, I take the center layer and hold it against the bottom of the blade where I want it to go. Then I trace out the path of the rod. When I cut this out and glue the layers together, this will leave a hole going all the way through the guard, the exact size of the rod. And to glue them, again I used contact cement. Now I have to shape the guard. It's not supposed to be a block with 90-degree edges. It's supposed to round off on the edges quite a bit. So to do this, I use a Sharpie to mark roughly how much needs to be removed, and use a utility knife to carve away a lot of the unwanted foam. After I get pretty close to what I want, I refine the edges with a Dremel and a sanding drum. This won't look amazing, and mine honestly isn't that great, and I can do a lot better, but it's not a big deal because I'm going to wrap this anyway, so no one will ever see it. Just make sure it's not extremely uneven, because that will show through. This sword has a few strips of something wrapped around the guard and the bottom of the blade. I have no idea what this is supposed to be, but it looks exactly the same as the strips that go on, around, and hang off of Blackstar's collar. I make these by cutting out long strips of 2mm foam, about an inch wide for the upper section of the guard as well as the blade, and about 3/4 of an inch for the bottom section. Then I cut out 2 equally long strips that are only about 1/8 of an inch wide that I superglue to the edges to make the race trim. I used superglue again to attach them to the sword and guard. I don't have footage of attaching them to the blade, so use the drawing of the blade on the right of the pattern as a guide. It's not perfect, but it's the basic idea of how they go. When I glue the strips on the guard down, I first figure out where I need to place the spikes. These are just wooden cones where the base is 1 inch in diameter and they're 2 inches tall. I'll link some in the description, but if the link no longer works at some point, please let me know and I'll try to update it with a new one. Anyway, I can use the cone to figure out where I need to cut away at the strip so the cone can be glued down later on. Then I cut that out and glue the strip down. To make the little circle details that go on these strips, I used one of my hole drills, I don't remember which one, on some 2mm foam, and used the circles that came from that. I cut out 4 for each side of the guard, so 8 in total, as well as 6 for each side of the blade, or 12 in total there. And for one of them on the blade, I could only make it look like it was tucked under the middle layer strip, so I just cut a small section off of the circle and glued it in to look like it was just barely peeking out. Honestly, there's no true way to do this. The art keeps changing how many circles are on each section, so just do whatever you think looks good. And then those were all attached again with superglue. I also don't have footage of painting the blade. It's pretty hard to get my camera outside, but I started with a few coats of Plastidip spray on the blade and guard, followed by gloss black spray paint for the blade, with the strips masked off. And since I masked off the strips, that meant the parts of the blade that you can see between them didn't get any paint. So after it was all dry, I took it inside and used gloss black acrylic paint on those parts. For the strips, I wanted to use a gray color that I mixed, but you can't paint very well over gloss, which is why I masked them off. You will notice the part of the guard between the strips is also black. I didn't paint that at all. You can't even see inside it anyways, so the Plastidip finish is fine. For the strips that go around the blade, I used that same gray, but I just tried to be as careful as possible and not get any on the blade. If you think you'll mess that up, go ahead and mask off the blade. I also used the same gray for the wooden cones that will be the spikes on the guard and the pommel. I just taped them down to some EVA foam scrap and painted them. Now onto the handle. I'm using a 1/2 inch thick PVC pipe and wrapping it with multiple layers of fabric. The pipe is cut 90 degrees on one end and about 45 degrees on the other end. Here's a little image I made that should help visualize the measurements. Also, the 45-degree end is the top that will be touching the handguard. So I don't know what this fabric is exactly, but it's one of those short curtain things that you can use as a secondary top layer over larger curtains to make them look fancy or something. But I cut one long strip down the length of it and spiral wrapped it down the pipe starting at the top. Then I wrapped it a second time, this time just going all the way back up. The next 2 layers is actually just one layer folded over itself to make it 2 layers thick. This way the edge that you can see spiraling down is a clean folded edge, and the fraying edge will be covered as it overlaps itself. And I glued it all down with super glue, slowly doing it in sections as I went down. On both ends of the handle, I need to make a strip that holds the fabric in place better. Plus, these are on the actual sword itself. The top would be whatever that piece is called that connects the handle to the guard, and the bottom is just the pommel. For the top piece that I don't know the name of, I used 2mm foam, and for the ring around the pommel, I used 5mm foam. I just cut strips and contact cemented them in place. Make sure to overhang the ring for the pommel about 4mm off of the edge. In the anime, it looks like the pommel spike is connected to the handle itself, with this ring wrapping around both of them. Not only will this give that same effect, this is literally what this is. Then I paint both pieces with that same mixed gray. This time I don't want to mask off the fabric because I don't know if the tape will ruin it or not, so I'm just as careful as I can be. I decide now to glue the spikes onto the guard in those sections that I cut out of the strips. Since I cut them before gluing the strips down, they aren't perfect, so I do have to do a little bit of trimming to get the spikes to settle in just right. Just be sure to press down really hard. The strips make them want to pop back out, so you may have to hold them for about 10 to 15 seconds to let most of the glue dry before letting go. The last detail that I need to paint is the white strip that runs along the center of the blade. This is why I used a paint with a gloss finish earlier. I'm using painter's tape to mask off the blade, so I only paint the area that needs the white strip. I used glossy paint because painter's tape doesn't stick to a gloss finish very well. I've had problems in the past with painter's tape pulling paint up when it's matte and easier to stick to, so this prevents that. But that makes painting on top of it a lot more annoying. After masking it off, I used a wide paintbrush to paint multiple layers of white to create the strip. And here's what it looks like after removing the mask. No worry about the black paint being peeled up by the tape, and nice crisp lines for the white strip. Now all that's left is to glue everything together. I start with the handle by taping some sandpaper to a dowel so that I can sand the inside of the PVC pipe. This will help the glue stick later. For the spike on the pommel, I used some liquid nails to glue a small piece of dowel in the center and wrapped it in tape to make a plug that goes into the PVC pipe, which I used hot glue to keep in place. The plug itself stayed in the handle, but it just snapped right off the spike, so I left it off until the very end, and then just finished the rest. I line up the blade to the guard and use a pen to mark where the glue needs to go. I made sure to make the marks smaller than the actual size of the blade so you don't see them. This is just to give me an idea of where the glue needs to go. Then I used an X-Acto knife to score in a bunch of lines inside the marked area and the base of the blade. This will help the glue grab on and have a much stronger hold. Then I super glued them together. To put the handle on, I first need to thicken up the metal rod. I do this by wrapping masking tape around it in 2 sections, and I test fit the handle as I go. Once the handle fits snug, I can stop wrapping. And I know this is kind of hard to see, sorry, there just isn't really anything I can do about that. To glue the handle on, I'm using Gorilla Glue. I first put a bunch in the handle without the rod in it, then I add more after the first section of tape. Gorilla Glue foams up, so putting it in between sections like this gives it the best result. I also use super glue on the top edge of the handle where it'll touch the guard to keep it from rotating while the Gorilla Glue cures. And finally, I fixed the pommel by using a little bit of Gorilla Glue to attach the spike. If you need to do this, be sure to either Gorilla Glue the spike plug in the first time, or be very careful if you have to do it the way I did. Since it foams up, if you use too much, it'll leak out of the sides, and you cannot get it off without destroying the foam ring. I sort of tried to help stop this by using super glue along the edge, hoping it would create some kind of super glue barrier or something, but I don't know how well that actually worked. So maybe just do it right the first time. Anyway, after that, just hit everything but the fabric with a glossy clear coat. Alright, so there's how you make Crona's sword Ragnarok from Soul Eater. Again, the wooden cones that I used for the spikes, I will link the ones that I bought down in the description. But if that link no longer works for whatever reason, maybe they're not selling them anymore, I don't know, then I'll try to find some other ones and link that instead, but be sure to comment and let me know that the link doesn't work anymore. I won't be checking it, so I won't know if it stops working, so if any of you try to click on it and it doesn't work, let me know. And if you guys have any other suggestions for things you want me to make, things you want me to cover or talk about, go ahead and leave those in the descriptions of really any of my videos, honestly, and I'll see about making videos for those. But anyway, that's going to be it for this video, so if you like it, go ahead and give it that thumbs up, subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys later.